August 17th, and missiles are flying toward the Crimean bridge. This is fucked, gentlemen. Unbelievable. The bridge has been blown up. The bridge has been blown up. Boom, boom, boom. Whoa. A new special operation by the SBU. Strikes on the bridge, the Black Sea Fleet, and Crimea's air defense. And something terrible has begun in Crimea. A new series of explosions on the peninsula. Tarkankut, Donuslav, Yevpatoria, Saki district, Bakhchisarai district, Kacha, Sevastopol. Explosions.
Right now, out of the 12 missiles that were heading directly toward the critical bridges, what you clearly see here in this image is the Chongar Bridge.
The Security Service of Ukraine is now launching a significant new phase of their special operation, actively attacking the strategically important Crimean Bridge, various military facilities, key airfields, and numerous military bases. Consequently, widespread panic and a rapid evacuation have already begun across the entire region of Crimea.
We've been standing here since 4:25 in the morning. We've been here for about 5 hours already. At 6, they turned us around and sent everyone home to rest.
We'll discuss all of this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan right now.
The oil depot. This is fucked, gentlemen.
A new series of explosions in Crimea. God, SBU, don't stop. Tarkankut, Donuslav, Yevpatoria, Saki district, Bakhchisarai district, Kacha, Sevastopol. Explosions. Panic has begun in Crimea. Evacuation is underway in Crimea. The SBU has launched the second phase of the special operation, the Kerch Bridge and Russia's nuclear triad. Ukraine is attacking two parts of Russia's nuclear triad, the headquarters of the Northern Fleet in Severomorsk, nuclear submarines, strategic nuclear bombers, and the Kerch Bridge.
The bridge has been damaged. That is, at least one of the bridge's supports has been damaged. If we look at the overall attack on Russian strategic targets, specifically strategic ones, because, for example, strikes on Russian strategic aviation aircraft are strategic targets, especially since there are 5 of them, as it turned out, 5, just as we said. The thing is, they didn't count the one at Ukrainka. At least one confirmed 295 at Ukrainka was hit. So strategic aviation, and after that, the strategic bridge. The bridge truly has strategic significance because it connects the Russian Taman with our Crimean peninsula. And if it is put out of commission, destroyed in principle until we liberate Crimea, or, for example, until it becomes possible to approach with bombers and simply drop hundreds of aerial bombs on this bridge, it cannot be destroyed. There are certain factors that make it impossible to do this. The only way is through engineering methods to destroy it, that is, by blowing up all the pillars. In other words, you would have to there will be a lot of problems just to deactivate it from its active state at the very least. But simply damaging it at the moment, as was done previously by the security service, and disabling it in 2022 and 2023 for a certain period, at least for half a year, for example, during the summer campaign, is actually possible. Moreover, a significant and impactful strike specifically on the strategically vital Kerch Bridge is intrinsically tied to the very beginning of our comprehensive liberation campaign to fully deoccupy the entire Crimean peninsula. Why? Because it is absolutely necessary to first destroy this bridge or damage it or put it out of commission. There are different ways to do this in order to prevent the Russians from transferring enough troops to Crimea. After that, using long-range strike capabilities such as drones and missiles, since it's only 200 to 300 kilometers to Crimea, we have the capability. Almost everything we have can reach that distance. In other words, that's the main range for our long-range operational level strike systems, which are also handled by the security service. Therefore, I think the next wave will be a strike specifically on military targets in Crimea, of which there are at least 100 stationary ones currently operating and about 100 mobile ones. So the work ahead for the special services is truly immense, an endless amount of so-called work. But this can already be considered a strike on the Kerch Bridge. This is the beginning of the liberation campaign in Crimea.
Roman Grigorievich regarding the nuclear triad. I heard a comment from Keith Kellogg. He is simply stunned. He believes that this is simply a huge, colossal problem for Russia. This is called escalation. That Ukraine struck at the nuclear triad of the Russian Federation at 2 components. The Northern Fleet of the Russian Federation, where the nuclear submarines are located, and of course the strategic nuclear aviation. How much of a breakthrough is this? And the fact that you feel the strike on the Kerch Bridge is the second phase of the SBU's special operation.
Well, that means there will be a third one as well. If, for example, they hit a Russian submarine, say in the Northern Fleet or the Pacific Fleet, I wouldn't be surprised because they feel far too comfortable in the seas. We have already struck both Russian ground positions and strategic positions, but there remains one so-called maritime component. That's why in the near future, most likely, if you remember, or rather if you haven't noticed, the main intelligence directorate has gone quiet somewhere. They carried out operations in Vladivostok against the Russian Pacific Fleet and then went quiet somewhere, not ruling out the possibility that yet another Russian submarine might sink. And Putin, as always, will say, so what happened to the Kursk, to the submarine? It sank. What happened to the strategic aviation? It burned down. What happened to the Pacific Fleet? Well, it broke down into quarks. So maybe we should wait. Perhaps there's still a third serious blow ahead. And this is the first one. You're right to point out the triad. You're emphasizing it correctly. Why? Because the air component is one of the main components, and it was the first to be put into service. It is specifically the strategic bombers that are Russia's strategic nuclear weapons. Malyuk's strike showed that this component no longer dominates the world, unequivocally. Why? Because, well, a $500 drone or simply a sufficient number of drones can practically destroy Russia's strategic aviation. This is possible. Everyone understands perfectly well that we have now entered the era of drones, the era of unmanned systems. It feels like in the near future, planet Earth will turn into a kind of planet Shelyazyaka. No water, no vegetation, no mineral resources, inhabited by robots. In other words, populated by these kinds of drones. And in the end, this apocalypse could very well come true, the one that was once shown in Hollywood movies. So this significant and pervasive problem truly does exist in virtually all countries and nations across the entire world that have thoughtfully and strategically invested in robust and comprehensive national security mechanisms and defense systems. I mean, what was the point of investing tens of trillions of dollars over the past 100 years into something that, in the end, a $500 drone can just take out in a matter of seconds? And that's exactly what Malyuk demonstrated. That's why I would say this. Malyuk and the security service of Ukraine have become the driving force at the start of a new era of security using different mechanisms. We really need to invest in robots. By robots, I mean, of course, these sophisticated drones. Drones that can accomplish truly major and significant tasks with very little funding indeed. Basically, all these strategies will eventually be destroyed. Once, if anyone remembers, Reagan, may he rest in peace, he had a great monologue where he said something. Where are those six-story fools, the dinosaurs? Where did they go extinct? But the little bug, it's been living and thriving there for 30 billion or however many, 3 billion years. So the next era will be something along those lines. In other words, the little bugs we're talking about now, the small drones, they will keep getting smaller and smaller, but without losing their combat effectiveness. And in the end, what will they come to? To what Putin recently predicted, together with Skabiva and the whole Russian media riffraff? Ukrainian combat mosquitoes. You were just laughing about combat mosquitoes. Believe me, when billions of Ukrainian combat mosquitoes invade Russian Siberia or beyond the Urals, I won't even mention it, not a single Russian will be left there. They'll be drawn to them by the scent. And the Russian spirit smells so strong, oh boy, no filter can help with that. You have to put on a gas mask if there's a Russian Fedrast standing nearby. So naturally, following the scent, these Ukrainian combat mosquitoes will wipe out the entire Russian herd, this whole Russian federalist herd that attacked Ukraine.
Roman Igorovich, regarding the Northern Fleet and the Pacific Fleet of Russia, how feasible is it to carry out a special operation there at all?
Well, it's definitely possible. As for the Northern Fleet, on the one hand, it's simply closer because it's just over 1,000 kilometers away, and we've already carried out missions there. Olenia is not far from the base. So in principle, this direction is possible even with long-range strike systems launched from our territory. And as for Vladivostok, on the one hand, that's even easier. We've discussed before, what is Vladivostok really? Well, it's the Green Wedge. It's the far eastern Ukrainian People's Republic, which is populated not by robots, but by Ukrainians. Well, Ukrainians For over 100 years, tens of thousands of Ukrainians were brought there under certain programs, mostly from the Poltava and Chernihiv regions. Why is there an airfield called Chernihivka there? Well, I know this, for example, from the airfields. Chernihivka and also Ukrainka. Those are our people from Poltava, Poltava natives and residents of the Chernihiv region back in the day. Naturally, genetic roots make themselves known. And Vladivostok is actually one of the main jewels of this green wedge of ours, our Ukrainian one. Vladivostok, of course, getting there is a bit of a challenge, all the more so if in the end we recognize the government in exile of the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic. Then it could even, for example, sign agreements with, say, Japan about the return of those same disputed islands, so-called disputed, but they're Japanese islands, and even Sakhalin is a Japanese island. So this issue needs to be addressed there in parallel, of course, putting pressure on the Pacific Fleet because there are Ukrainians in the fleet as well. Do you really think our midshipmen aren't there? Every other person there is bound to be Ukrainian, our solid, deep-rooted genetic tree among the midshipmen, because back in the Soviet army, all the warrant officers were Ukrainians, and all the midshipmen in the fleet were Ukrainians too. So believe me, if the task is set, survival of our nation, then this so-called call of our ancestors will make it possible to sink practically the entire Pacific Fleet. And if we approach our relations with the Japanese and South Koreans the right way, they'll even help us because it's in their interest too.
Roman Grigorievich, when I spoke with military analysts, they said that the Topol and Yars are part of the powerful nuclear arsenal of the Russian Federation. How important are these assets? And for example, is the destruction of a Topol or Yars also a realistic goal for the special services, Ukrainian ones, of course?
Well, that's rather difficult, of course. The thing is, these are, after all, strategic forces, missile forces. That is, there is a certain selection process for service there. There are some aspects related to polygraph testing, so there is very strict control over this particular component. And it would be very difficult, for example, to approach and somehow destroy these missiles. The Russians will ruin them themselves. Well, you see, they're all butterfingers anyway. They'll ruin them themselves. The Topol is an excellent, excellent missile. It was first launched, I think, back in the 1980s in the Soviet Union. And then the Russians refined it to a more or less acceptable state. But the main basic, so to speak, fundamental starting conditions were, of course, still from the Soviet Union. They had a good school there, a rocket school, especially after our Ukrainian basically bet everything on the rocket program, if you remember. That is, as General Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee, Khrushchev fulfilled this task and Brezhnev refined it further. Again, both of them were Ukrainians. That's why the rocket field was, of course, very well developed in the Soviet Union. The Russians picked up certain aspects, but because the Soviet Union collapsed, the components of the overall production cycle ended up scattered across different republics. By the way, the main ones were here in Ukraine because we built the SS-18, the so-called Satan at Yuzhmash. Naturally, the Topol missile is a successor in this kind of rocket program, especially the Topol-M. It's a pretty good missile. The second one after it is also, well, not exactly a clone, but basically the same kind of missile, just with a different warhead, one with multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. That's the Yars. So after the Topol, then the Yars, the RS-24, and then the RS-26, they built or tried to build the Oreshnik, the so-called Rubezh. That's the Rubezh, which Putin called Oreshnik. And the next in the lineup, the fourth missile, is the RS-28, which is the Sarmat. Well, the Sarmat can't even get out of its launch silos. Out of 7 launches, there have been 6 explosions and several silos were completely destroyed. And most likely this whole series of missiles is finished. So they won't really have the Sarmat and they'll keep fussing over the Oreshnik like a fool with a rattle. But once it's informational, well, its possible pressure runs out, they'll forget about it too. But there are 2 missiles that are serious and problematic for us and for the whole world as well, the Topol and the Yars. They can travel more than 10,000 kilometers. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles. Both the Topol and the Yars have nuclear warheads, and the Yars has multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, each with self-guidance, around 6 warheads that are deployed. So this is actually a serious issue, though probably not so much for us because, well, these are nuclear weapons and the Russians aren't going to use nukes against us. And as for firing a conventional intercontinental ballistic missile at us, well, that's like using a microscope to hammer in nails. So this isn't a problem for us. It's a problem for NATO generals and for the Chinese as well. In other words, these are long-range destruction mechanisms. For us, the main problem is the Iskanders. The Iskander KN-23s and also the Kinzhal missiles, that is both ballistic and aeroballistic missiles, which need to be neutralized. The optimal way to neutralize the use of these missiles is, of course, to destroy the Russian hydrocarbon industry, because everything depends on something. Diesel, gasoline, they fly on aviation kerosene. The hydrocarbon sector needs to be destroyed. Bankova has ensured the safety of the Russian hydrocarbon sector. That's why this problem exists, because it's very difficult to defend against a ballistic missile. We should have had our own a long time ago. It's already the 7th year. We probably could have put these missiles into serious production by now, but so far they still haven't appeared. Well, we hope that in the end we will get them our own ballistic missiles. But the real problem for us, of course, is the Russian Iskanders, because first we need to destroy all Russian oil refineries, everything related to fuel production. And second, of course, is air defense. That is increasing the number of anti-ballistic systems like Patriot SMT. There is no third option.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Roman Grigorievich, you have always said that we need to turn our attention to the occupied Crimea. And now the SBU has carried out a successful special operation. Then they blew up the bridges near Melitopol. Yes, these are very important logistical hubs that connect the occupied peninsula with the occupied south of Ukraine. And essentially, they sustain the enemy's grouping. How do you assess the situation now? Last night there were explosions, and during the day the explosions in Crimea continue. We are attacking military targets. Please, the floor is yours.
They packed several million Russians from beyond the Urals into Crimea like sardines in a can, who were promised something great there. In other words, they increased the number of Russian livestock in Crimea. Naturally, they also packed military facilities in there over the course of 11. Well, it's practically the 12th year now. Before that, the Russian Black Sea Fleet was based there. We allowed them to do this. Well, mostly our so-called great leaders who looked so far ahead that in the end, they lost Crimea in the first place, initially allowing its loss back in 2014. So, a very large number of Russian civilian invaders, and they are indeed civilian invaders. None of the established laws apply to them, but they don't even truly know that. Any Russian citizen who is on the occupied territory of Ukraine is considered an invader, and none of the conventions that apply to civilians apply to them. That is naturally for us, they are the same kind of invaders as all the other so-called Russian military combatants who are in Crimea and are subject to elimination. Eliminating them in principle is not that difficult, especially in Crimea. Why? Because Crimea itself is a closed space squeezed between two seas, the Azov and the Black Sea. In other words, it is practically a ready-made geographic operational cauldron with only two entry and exit routes, from Taman via the Kerch Bridge and through land corridors connecting it to mainland Ukraine. Mainly, if you look at the railway, it goes out toward Melitopol through Henichesk, meaning those branches go there. That's why it's important for us, when liberating Ukraine, to start by liberating Crimea, because it will be much easier to free Ukrainian territory if we liberate Crimea first. Moreover, it's even easier to liberate Crimea itself. If you compare, for example, the ratio of forces and resources needed to liberate Donbas, you need an order of magnitude fewer forces and resources to liberate Crimea than to liberate Donbas. That's why, without a doubt, Crimea is just asking to be the first, the very first to break free from Russian captivity. There are many mechanisms. How can this be done? Well, the first thing, of course, is to cut off all the bridges that connect Crimea to the Russians. There are several of these bridges. Well, the first bridge is the Kerch Bridge. Moreover, there are several there. There's a railway bridge, a road bridge, an energy bridge, a fuel bridge, and a water bridge. All of these are part of the Kerch system, the entire Kerch Bridge system. And it is absolutely necessary to destroy all of them. All 5 of these bridges must be eliminated in this regard. The second bridge, which is next to the Kerch Bridge, is the ferry crossing. The floating docks need to be destroyed. The floating docks, and of course, especially the railroad ferries. The third bridge of this kind is the so-called sea bridge. That is, these are the same LSTs, large landing ships, that can be used as ferries between ports, for example, on the Russian Black Sea coast and our Crimea. There are still several large landing ships left, and the Russians can use them to transport a significant amount of weaponry. They have serious tonnage. Then there's the air bridge. Well, the air bridge is a bit simpler. That is, these are planes, these are airfields which can be targeted, and in principle, the air bridge can be cut off. And the main one, of course, is the so-called land bridge, the land corridor, which the Russians are now trying to hold at a depth of 80 kilometers. By the way, it's very difficult to do this since it's pressed up against the Azov coast. There are several branches running there, both highways and railways, railway lines. So, of course, those can be targeted as well, starting from Rostov, Taganrog, then through the Mius, then across the Kalmius bridges. But realistically, of course, it's very close for us, about 80 to 100 kilometers to Melitopol and to the crossings, both types, meaning the northern crossings. And in principle, that's probably what we'll do. These strikes, which happen simultaneously on both the Kerch Bridge and the bridge near Melitopol, were precisely on the railway junctions. This is exactly that kind of operation. First, cut off the supply systems, and then hit them with long-range strike assets, which we have, well, everyone understands perfectly. If we manage to gather nearly 1,000 drones for Moscow, then we can definitely find 500 drones for Crimea at least once a week. The main thing now is to refocus specifically on this component, and the milestone regarding the liberation of Crimea is the third strike on the Kerch Bridge. You could say that the liberation of Crimea will begin with this strike. First, with long-range strike assets, they will dismantle Crimea molecule by molecule over the course of, half a year or even a year. Realistically, if you break it down by actions first, for several months up to a year, drones and missiles need to be used against military targets in Crimea. And only then, starting next spring, or perhaps during the summer campaign of 2026, will our troops actually move into Crimea by land. Well, that's the optimal scenario. Of course, without air support, it's impossible to advance there. That's why I think that by next spring, we'll already have a sufficient number of aviation units to provide support specifically for a ground operation. And of course, we'll keep harassing Crimea in the meantime.
All in all, the summer of 2025 in the beautiful and historic region of Crimea promises to be a very hot and eventful one.
Absolutely. And the Russians really need to start remembering, as we discussed with you back in 2023, they need to learn how to swim because the Kerch Bridge won't be there. The exits from Crimea will definitely be under control. That's why Russians will have to swim, crawl, breaststroke, or doggy paddle out of Crimea if they don't leave now by car or train, because those options simply won't exist.
Run, get out of Crimea while you still can. Friends, please like this video. Let us know in the comments what you think about our special operations, about the second and third phases of the SBU's special operation. And Roman Grigorievich and I are continuing our discussion about the SBU Operation Web. It can be put on par with the elimination of Osama bin Laden, said US Senator Richard Blumenthal. He called the operation itself proof of Ukraine's skill and determination. He said that these strikes disprove the false narrative that Ukraine is losing the war and could shift momentum in Washington toward increasing aid to Ukraine. They can strike air bases 4,000 miles from Ukraine. They can hit anywhere. Through sheer skill and audacity, these attacks can be ranked alongside the US raid on Osama bin Laden and the Israeli operation with the PLO as some of the greatest military achievements of recent years. Roman Grigorievich, please comment.
Yes, the Americans were shocked, not because we struck the Russians. The Americans tried this situation on for themselves, and now they're shocked to realize that their air bases are just as exposed as the Russian ones. They were protected from each other by treaties. That is to say, there were certain, I think the third one specifically provided comprehensive protection for strategic strike assets under these important treaties. Moreover, one of the primary and most significant conditions was that these planes had to be readily accessible for continuous monitoring by external surveillance systems such as advanced satellites. So it turns out that the Russians, just like the Americans, are absolutely required to park their military planes in clearly designated areas that are always visible to the opposing side, ensuring transparency and reducing potential misunderstandings. But we're not adversaries, are we? No one told Malyuk about this. He didn't read this script. Naturally, he just went ahead and struck the Russian strategic bombers, taking one issue off the table. And now the Americans are thinking, wait a minute, the same thing could happen to their bases too. And their bases are exposed. There's nothing in place there really. If the Chinese or the Houthis or the Iranians or the Russians decide to take out the Russian strategic assets, the American strategic assets, they could do that too. And there it would be serious, especially if the Chinese get involved. We can see that in this regard, the Chinese are ahead of everyone else in the world. That's their problem. They're not shocked by our so-called audacity. They're shocked by their own vulnerability to these kinds of strike capabilities like drones, even a simple cheap drone.
Yes, Roman Grigorievich, today I read a brilliant analysis by a Ukrainian patriot woman on Facebook. She wrote that the whole world, which is afraid of escalation, of nuclear escalation, which didn't give us long-range missiles, which didn't give us Taurus and other missiles that could have allowed us to destroy this entire nuclear triad, they're simply shocked and frightened that Ukraine managed to do all this without their help. Isn't that right, Roman Grigorievich?
Well, that's exactly how it is. Credit to the person who saw it this way, someone who is closely involved with military matters. That's exactly how it is. What was important in the last century is now absolutely irrelevant, just as what was important in the century before last was irrelevant for the last century, right? No one now remembers the sling or the boomerang. Of course, I don't mean the missile. No one remembers bows, arrows, or spears anymore. Now, I mean in the last century when rockets appeared, when airplanes appeared, and now we're already at the next stage. So what was needed in the last century is simply unnecessary now. Strategic bombers are no longer needed, nor, for example, is that same Navy that used to consume trillions of dollars. I mean, just think how much had to be invested, trillions of dollars. And here, it turns out, Maliuk, by making the decision to destroy Russia's strategic aviation, has basically crossed out this almost century-long saga of, to be honest, looting the most powerful military budgets. Trillions of dollars were invested in this, and now they're simply unnecessary. A single Ukrainian security service showed a big fat nothing to this entire strategic triad, no matter what it was. Moreover, even the nuclear component of this strategic triad isn't frightening for us for one simple reason. We have nuclear strike capabilities that are much more powerful, stronger, and more problematic for the enemy than theirs. A nuclear warhead that explodes sometimes, even then, it's not always clear whether it was a nuclear explosion or just a powerful conventional missile. You can only measure it with a radiometer. The radiance from radionuclides that accompanies a nuclear explosion, if it is an explosion, fades quickly. And believe me, if you scatter spent nuclear fuel rods over Moscow, we've talked about this so many times, Lenin would come back to life. Yes, he'd be more alive than anyone from the radiation that would fall, say, on Red Square if the Russians used nuclear weapons against Ukraine. They understand this perfectly well. Why have they gone quiet on the nuclear topic now? Because they realized very well that it was no accident a hole was made in the fourth reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Who knows what might fall out onto Grandpa Lenin? He might even grow a third head and start running around saying, "You're on the right path, comrades." Well, roughly in the direction they'll be pointing.
Roman Grigorievich, to wrap up, let me ask you the following question. First of all, after the SBU attacks on strategic nuclear aviation, Z channels reported the following information, that in Moscow, Lieutenant General Sergei Kobylash, the commander of the Russian Air Force, accidentally fell out of a window. And now everyone is starting to count how many strategic bombers we have destroyed or eliminated. That is, 41 have been damaged or destroyed. How significant are these losses? Please comment on this as a final point.
Well, if this isn't a PSYOP, and it could be a Russian PSYOP, since they sometimes leak this kind of event into the information flow through certain questionable channels. And then if the opposing side picks it up, for example, they present it as something negative. Then they show this Kobylash, yes, and we'll go on to say that we are not quite the right kind of people in how we approach this. So for now, since there is no confirmation, and there really isn't any, we treat it accordingly. Although, strictly speaking, in terms of responsibility, well, Kobylash should have flown. And as for who made him, so to speak, fly or will make him, that will depend on the Russian special services. Because if we're talking about real responsibility, it was specifically Kobylash's responsibility to ensure the security of Russia's strategic nuclear triad. So if not now, then later he'll have to fly. How else could it be?
Dear audience, please like this video. Roman Grigorievich and I meet 3 times a week to discuss the most pressing military topics and to celebrate the successes of our Ukrainian special services and the armed forces of Ukraine. We thank them. Our deepest respect, the well-known analyst Roman Svetan. Roman Grigorievich, thank you very much as always. See you soon later this week.
Goodbye.